For countless generations, the human species lived in quiet balance with the world around it. We moved. We followed the rains and the migrations of herds. We left no scar upon the landscape heavier than the ashes of a campfire or a footprint in the mud. Anatomically, these people were identical to us. They possessed the same capacity for language, the same depth of emotion, and the same intellectual potential to solve complex problems. Yet, for 97% of our history, they built no walls. They bowed to no kings. They fought no wars of conquest. Then the pattern broke. In a geological instant, our species fundamentally altered its relationship with the planet. We stopped moving. We enclosed the wild. We reorganized the hierarchy of nature into the rigid geometry of the field and the city. The transformation from the foraging band to the high-density state remains the most radical rupture in the history of our biology. It was the turning point when our species stopped adapting to the world and began reshaping it. The popular imagination often portrays the pre-agricultural world as one of constant starvation and misery, a life supposedly nasty, brutish, and short. The bones tell a different story. Skeletal analysis from the Upper Paleolithic reveals a population in notably strong physical condition. Men and women stood tall, averaging heights that Europeans would not reach again until the 20th century. Their bones were dense, showing no signs of the repetitive stress injuries that would later plague farmers. These groups were not living on the edge of extinction. They were highly adapted to their environment. Survival depended on an understanding of animal behavior, seasonal plant cycles, and landscape patterns passed down across generations. A single band required a territory of hundreds of square miles to sustain itself, moving as resources ripened, migrated, or disappeared. Socially, these groups operated under what anthropologists describe as an immediate return economy. Food was consumed shortly after it was acquired. Without effective methods to preserve meat or plants for long periods, accumulation was impossible. Wealth could not be stored and therefore could not be monopolized. This limitation produced a clear political outcome: strong egalitarianism. Dominance hierarchies common among other primates were actively resisted. If an individual attempted to coerce others or hoard resources, the group possessed a simple and effective response: they could leave. In a world without borders or fixed property, freedom was measured in distance. For thousands of years during the Pleistocene epoch, this balance held. Human populations remained low, constrained by the carrying capacity of the wild environment. We were a predator that fit within the existing food web rather than reshaping it. The climate reinforced this condition. The Earth remained in a glacial state. Temperatures fluctuated sharply. Ice sheets advanced and retreated. Environmental instability made long-term settlement impossible. The Earth offered no purchase for farming until the ice began to melt. Around 12,000 years ago, the Holocene epoch began. The planet entered a period of warmer, more stable conditions. In the Near East, this climate shift created a corridor of sustained abundance known as the Fertile Crescent. Here, natural conditions worked in humanity's favor. The region was home to the wild ancestors of the crops that would later feed much of the world: emmer wheat, einkorn, barley, chickpeas, lentils, and flax. These plants grew in dense, naturally occurring stands. Gazelle herds migrated through these valleys in large numbers. For the foraging bands living here, the basic logic of survival shifted. For the first time, the energy gained from food vastly outweighed the energy spent finding it. It was here that a culture known as the Natufians emerged. They provide the first critical clue in the mystery of civilization. For generations, we believed that agriculture caused people to settle down. that humans learned to farm and then built villages to tend their crops. The Natufian evidence suggests the opposite. They settled long before they planted a single seed. The reliable supply of wild grains allowed them to build permanent circular stone houses. They constructed heavy storage pits and grinding stones weighing hundreds of pounds, objects that greatly limited mobility and signaled a lasting claim to the land. They became sedentary hunter-gatherers. With permanent homes came deeper social changes. The Natufians began to bury their dead in defined burial areas, often beneath the floors of their homes. A new concept was taking root in the human mind: ancestry and inheritance, transforming the land from a space to move through into a place tied to memory, lineage, and obligation. Sedentism triggered a biological chain reaction. In a mobile band, a mother can only carry one infant at a time. Births are naturally spaced by 4 or 5 years. In a settled village, that constraint vanishes. Natufian women could bear children every 2 years. As a consequence, the population size grew. Small bands of a few dozen people expanded into villages of several hundred. The pressure on the local environment increased. The wild abundance that had made settlement possible was being consumed faster than it could regenerate. And then, the climate turned against them. Around 10,800 BCE, a sudden climatic reversal known as the Younger Dryas struck the northern hemisphere. Glacial meltwater poured into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean circulation patterns that had helped stabilize global temperatures. The climate cooled rapidly. In the Levant, environmental conditions deteriorated, woodlands retreated, grasslands thinned. The ecological cycles that had supported dense communities started to fail. For the Natufians, this shift created an unprecedented challenge. The abundance that had made permanent settlement possible was disappearing. They faced a stark choice. One option was to abandon their villages, dismantle their large communities, and return to a fully mobile way of life. But this would have required a drastic reduction in population. The surrounding environment could no longer sustain so many people as foragers. The other option was to intervene. Unable to rely on the natural regeneration of wild grain, they moved to manage it. They cleared competing plants. They selected and relocated seeds. They altered soil conditions and controlled access to water. These actions marked a fundamental shift in our bond with the landscape. Agriculture was not adopted as a path toward progress or abundance. It emerged as a strategy for survival. Farming was not born from ambition, but from pressure. A way to stabilize a society that could no longer return to its previous balance. Human intervention began to transform wheat's structure. By repeatedly collecting and replanting these variants, humans unintentionally altered the plant's biology. Domesticated wheat lost the ability to reproduce independently. The shift to agriculture brought a marked decline in individual health. Diets that once included a wide range of plants, animals, fibers, and micronutrients narrowed to a heavy reliance on starchy grains. Nutritional diversity gave way to caloric uniformity. The skeletal record reflects this change. Average adult height in early farming populations of the Near East fell by several inches. New physical stresses also came. Processing grain required hours of repetitive labor. Joints deteriorated, spines compressed. Women who performed much of this work often developed chronic damage to their feet and lower backs from prolonged kneeling at grinding stones. Permanent settlements introduced another risk: disease. Mobile hunter-gatherer groups rarely provided stable conditions for pathogens to persist. Agricultural communities did. Dense populations lived in close quarters, often alongside newly domesticated animals. Shared water, air, and waste created pathways for infections to cross species barriers. Illnesses such as influenza, tuberculosis, and smallpox found new opportunities to spread. Despite declining health and increasing labor, the agricultural engine continued to expand. Farming yielded far more calories per unit of land, supporting larger populations, even if individual lives were shorter and more fragile. Reproductive success replaced physical resilience as the dominant evolutionary advantage. Population density increased, villages grew, and with them came a challenge humanity had never faced before: living permanently beside strangers. In open landscapes, conflict could be resolved through movement. If two foragers disagreed, they separated. In an agricultural society, separation carried a far greater cost. A farmer invested months of labor into a single plot of land. His survival was bound to that soil. Leaving meant abandoning the harvest, and with it, the future. Immobility reshaped human relationships. Land was now a fixed resource, claimed, cultivated, and defended. The idea of exclusive property began to take form, and where value concentrates, protection follows. At Jericho, around 8000 BCE, we encounter one of the earliest physical expressions of this shift. The settlement was enclosed by a massive stone wall and dominated by a tower nearly 30 feet high. For decades, archaeologists debated its purpose: flood control, ritual monument, communal symbol. Today, most interpretations converge on a practical explanation. The structure protected stored resources. In a world where food could be accumulated, it could also be taken. A granary filled with grain represented both security and vulnerability. Agriculture did not simply produce food, it produced targets. Raiding replaced wandering. Defense became a necessity. Violence reorganized itself around territory, storage, and control. Such systems required coordination. Large-scale construction and surplus management could not arise from informal agreement alone. Someone had to plan, someone had to direct labor. Gradually, social symmetry weakened. The egalitarian structure of mobile societies gave way to hierarchy. Certain individuals gained influence by controlling resources, organizing labor, or managing protection. Archaeology records this shift in the dead. Most burials remained simple, but a small number grew increasingly elaborate, adorned with materials transported over long distances: obsidian from Anatolia, turquoise from Sinai, shells from the Mediterranean. Status had entered the grave. The divide between accumulation and scarcity, between influence and dependence, had begun to widen. For the first time in history, inequality was not merely temporary, it was becoming structural. For millennia, the Neolithic experiment remained in the hills, where the rain was kind and the effort modest. Seasonal rains arrived with reasonable regularity, and crops could be grown without extensive intervention. Around 5000 BCE, growing populations pressed outward. Communities descended from earlier Neolithic farmers moved beyond the hills into the broad, low-lying basin between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Mesopotamia. In its natural state, this landscape was hostile to settlement. Rainfall was scarce. Summer temperatures reached extreme levels. The rivers, while life-giving, were volatile, capable of sudden floods that erased fields and dwellings with little warning. The environment oscillated between drought and inundation. Yet beneath these hazards lay extraordinary potential. Over thousands of years, the rivers had deposited deep layers of fertile silt. Few soils on Earth could match its capacity to produce food, provided water could be controlled and directed. The settlers of the southern alluvial plain made a consequential choice. They abandoned dependence on rainfall and embraced irrigation. Survival would now depend on canals, embankments, and coordinated labor. It was a trade-off that reshaped human society. The uncertainty of rain was replaced by the discipline of water management. In exchange for the highest yields on Earth, they accepted constant maintenance. The agricultural system had crossed a threshold. From this point forward, civilization would no longer rest on the rhythms of nature, but on constant human intervention. To water a field in southern Mesopotamia, canals had to be cut across miles of terrain. Silt had to be removed season after season. Embankments had to be raised to contain the spring floods. These tasks exceeded the capacity of a household, and even of a single village. They required sustained, coordinated labor on a large scale. Water had to be allocated, scheduled, and overseen. From this necessity, a new authority emerged. The decentralized autonomy of earlier communities gave way to centralized command. Those who controlled the flow of water controlled survival. Some framed this authority in religious terms, claiming to mediate between human communities and the forces governing the rivers. In practice, their power rested in administration, measurement, and enforcement. Compliance ensured access. Disobedience meant exclusion. By around 4000 BCE, the southern Mesopotamian plains were no longer natural landscapes shaped primarily by climate. They were engineered environments, networks of canals, fields, and storage centers operating as a unified system of production. At the center of this system, population density increased rapidly. What had begun as agricultural management was evolving into something far more permanent. The foundations of the first cities were taking shape. By around 3800 BCE, the village was no longer the dominant form of human settlement. The city had taken shape. Uruk represented an entirely new mode of existence. At its height, between 40 and 50,000 people lived within roughly 6 miles of walls. For a species that evolved to live in small bands of a few dozen individuals, this level of density was unprecedented. In a village, social life was governed by familiarity. In Uruk, that system broke down. Each day, an individual moved among thousands of strangers. At this point, social cohesion could no longer rely on personal relationships. It required institutions. The city functioned as a powerful magnet. It drew raw materials from vast distances, timber from the Zagros Mountains, copper from Oman, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, pulling entire regions into its economic orbit. At the center stood the temple complex, operating as both a religious authority and an economic landlord. It controlled the fields, the canals, and the herds. The population became dependent on institutional estates for access to land, food, and security. This transformation is visible in the most common artifact of the Uruk period, the mass-produced clay bowl. Archaeologists call it the beveled rim bowl. Millions of them are scattered across the ruins of Mesopotamia. They are crude, mold-made, and nearly identical, produced quickly in enormous quantities with no concern for durability or beauty. These vessels functioned as standardized ration containers. Each bowl held a fixed volume, representing a daily allotment distributed to workers. The uniformity of the bowls suggests a system designed for measurement, not for family life. Their presence reveals a profound shift in how people lived. Large segments of the population were no longer producing their own food. They labored on canals, walls, and fields controlled by institutions, and in return, received measured rations from centralized storehouses. Food became compensation. Labor became abstracted. The independent producer was replaced by the dependent worker. The city's walls offered protection, but they also enforced permanence. Leaving the system meant abandoning access to food itself. As Uruk expanded, human memory reached its limits. Administration required something new. Writing emerged as a practical solution. The earliest clay tablets from Uruk contain no stories or myths. They are records, inventories, tax assessments, wage distributions. The first written symbols represent commodities and labor: barley, sheep, units of work. Writing began as accounting. This development altered power relationships. Information became centralized. Access to records determined authority. Those who could read and write controlled the flow of resources. The scribe emerged as a new specialist, not a ruler, but an intermediary between people and the system that governed them. With written records, institutions gained a level of oversight that had previously been impossible. Production, storage, and labor could be quantified, predicted, and enforced. Obligations were fixed in clay. Administration no longer relied on trust or memory, but on recorded data. The city had acquired a memory beyond the human mind, and with it, a new form of control. By 2500 BCE, the priest's dominance was fading. A new power had eclipsed the temple, the Lugal, the king. As Mesopotamian cities expanded across the floodplain, they collided. Disputes over land and water hardened into organized conflict. The small-scale raids of earlier societies gave way to standing armies, and warfare shifted from a sporadic event to a permanent institution. With this came a monopoly on force. The king offered a stark transaction: protection from rivals in exchange for loyalty, labor, and taxes. Security became political leverage. This militarization reshaped the nature of captivity. In mobile bands, prisoners were liabilities. Within city walls, confinement was now possible and economically useful. Captives were not killed but absorbed, forced to raise the walls and dig the canals of their conquerors. Cuneiform records reflect this reality. The sign used to denote a slave combines the symbol for foreigner and human, encoding conquest directly into language. The infrastructure of early civilizations rested not just on voluntary devotion, but on the coerced labor of those taken in war. Mesopotamia established an early model of urban civilization, but it was not the only one. Along the Nile, a different environment forged a different form of power. Protected by deserts and fed by predictable floods, Egypt favored stability over constant conflict. Here, political power and religious authority were absolute. The pharaoh was not merely a king, but a divine figure, a god, the sole guarantor of Ma'at, the cosmic balance between order and chaos. Further east, the Indus Valley presents a paradox. Cities such as Mohenjo-Daro use standardized bricks, organized street grids, and advanced drainage systems. Yet these cities present a puzzle. Archaeologists have found little evidence of palaces, royal tombs, or standing armies. Power may have been distributed through mercantile elites, ritual authority, or social norms we no longer fully understand. Without a deciphered script, their system of rule remains a mystery, perhaps a complex civilization without kings. Meanwhile, across the Yellow River and in the Americas, independent centers of civilization rose on different crops. Each region domesticated different staples: millet, rice, maize, potatoes. But the underlying pattern repeated. Surplus enabled population growth. Population density required coordination. Coordination produced hierarchy. Hierarchy gave rise to the state. Different environments shaped different cultures, but the structural pressures of civilization pushed humanity onto a single, converging path. The world we inhabit today is the continuation of a system whose foundations were laid thousands of years ago. In many ways, we still live within the structure first assembled by early agricultural societies. The concentration of power, the strain on land and resources, the vulnerability to disease, and the constant negotiation between security and personal freedom. The rise of civilization was a trade-off. Human societies gained the ability to reshape landscapes, coordinate vast populations, and preserve knowledge across generations. These capacities made large-scale culture, science, and technology possible, but they came at a price. Life became embedded in systems that demanded obedience, labor, and permanence. The open freedom of the foraging world gave way to something more complex, crowded, productive, innovative, and constrained. Civilization did not replace nature. It enclosed it. By around 2300 BCE, the age of isolated city-states was drawing to a close. With the expansion of the urban centers, conflicts over territorial control intensified. Power began to scale. If one ruler could dominate a city, the next question was inevitable. How many cities could be ruled at once? In the city of Akkad, a man emerged who refused the traditional limits of kingship. He did not seek to govern a single urban center. He sought to bind many into one political body. Through conquest, administration, and force, he would unify the river plains under a single authority. In doing so, he created something new, the world's first empire. His name was Sargon, and his story begins next.